Hey guys! Tonight we tiptoe through the velvet fog of a Victorian garden just as the first ribbons of dawn unfurl across the hedgerows. There's dew clinging to your boots, birds still undecided on whether to chirp or keep their beaks shut, and in the distance, yes, that's a man in a waistcoat whispering in Latin to a cabbage. You rub your eyes. Nope, he's still doing it. Welcome to the glorious weirdness of 19th century Britain, where even the broccoli got better compliments than most spouses. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and what time it is where you're listening from down in the comments. I always love seeing where you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge past the clipped yew hedges and pause near a greenhouse. Inside, a gardener in his 50s, Edward maybe or something solid like that, murmurs sweet encouragement to a patch of lettuces. His breath fogs a glass. His hands are thick with soil, and his voice is soft as wool. If this looks a little mad to you, congratulations, you're not a Victorian. But back then, this wasn't madness. It was devotion. You shift your weight, crunch a few gravel pebbles, and lean closer. He's saying things like, "My fine green boys, you dummy proud," and "Show those dahlias who's boss." It's part performance, part prayer. And if you think he's alone in this, you haven't seen the Queen's gardeners. The Victorians were in love with nature, but it wasn't a passive affair. They wrote love letters to it, etched poems for it, and most charmingly of all, they talked to it, literally, with words, out loud, sometimes in Latin, sometimes in rhyming couplets, and often with more tenderness than they showed to their own children. This was more than quaint eccentricity. It was a cultural practice rooted in science, spiritualism, and a touch of good old British emotional repression. Now, imagine this. It's 1842, and a young gardener named Frederick starts his apprenticeship at a manor just outside Bath. He's taught to rake, water, weed, and to talk. Not to the other staff. No, to the plants. His mentor, a crusty veteran named Mr. Potts, insists on it. "Talk to them, lad," he says. They like a good voice. Calms them. Encourages them. And Frederick, being 17 and scared of losing his new job, complies. He begins each morning with greetings to the rhubarb and apologies to the roses he accidentally clipped too hard yesterday. He starts to feel, in the way one does when speaking aloud in solitude, that he's being listened to, that something in the green silence is answering back, not with words, but with growth, blossoms, resilience. And here's the thing, he wasn't the only one. Queen Victoria's own gardener, James Veitch, famously instructed his staff to approach the plants with care and character, though he didn't quite write Shakespearean sonnets to begonias. There were whispers as orchids responded better to music and compliments than to fertilizer. Whether this was observational bias or genuinely botanical behavior, well, that's the debate. Historians still argue whether Victorian gardeners really believed their conversations changed plant health, or whether it was more of a meditative ritual, a form of focus, like prayer beads or reciting multiplication tables. One camp suggests that speaking aloud simply helped gardeners concentrate and remain attentive. The other, more romantic camp, believes they were on to something, that the cadence of human voice, the vibrations, the warmth, the emotional intention, somehow resonated in the chlorophyll. You take a seat on a damp stone bench and watch Edward, our cabbage whisperer, shuffle over to a bed of violas. His tone softens, and though his words are near inaudible, you catch one phrase: "You're safe now." It's hard not to be moved. He could be talking to a soldier returned from war, not a plant barely 6 inches high. Even back then, some skeptics laughed. A letter to the Gardener's Chronicle in 1856 mockingly suggested that if talking to plants worked, they should begin publishing novels for their amusement. The sarcasm wasn't lost on the readers, but it also didn't stop anyone. In fact, the more the Industrial Revolution grinded soot into London's lungs, the more Victorians clung to their gardens. They saw nature not just as a retreat, but as a companion. Plants became confidantes. You'll find entire journals from the era filled with diary entries like, "The lilies look mournful today. I think they miss the sun." Or, "My foxglove seems to perk when I hum Mendelssohn." Even Charles Darwin, stiff-collared and famously skeptical, dipped a cautious toe into this verdant conversation. He performed experiments on how plants responded to touch and direction of light. Though he didn't publicly claim they responded to voice, his private notes showed a fascination with their awareness. Tiny, slow-moving awareness, but awareness nonetheless. Some more eccentric figures went further. Lady Helena Paget, an aristocrat botanist with far too much money and not enough company, was rumored to read aloud chapters from romantic novels to her greenhouse, claiming it improved the sweetness of tomatoes. Her friends rolled their eyes until her produce began winning local prizes. Here's a quirk. Several manuals from the late 1800s recommended speaking to melancholy plants in the same tone one might use for troubled children. Gentle, encouraging, never harsh. One suggested start with phrases like, "I see you're struggling," or "Would you like a bit more sun?" The idea was empathy, not instruction. You stretch your legs and glance up at a passing crow. It doesn't care, obviously, but you're starting to. This strange blend of science, superstition, and sincere care is oddly compelling. Of course, it wasn't all whimsy. There were gardeners who swore at their plants. Seriously, believing it toughened them up. One memorable figure, a Yorkshireman named Bill Taverner, gained notoriety for his verbal composting. He'd curse like a sailor while pruning, then apologize and whisper encouragement. His neighbors thought he was mad. His carrots were enormous. And then there's the voice frequency theory. Yes, even that existed back then. Some amateur botanists claimed that deeper male voices stirred root systems, while higher voices made petals open faster. One odd experiment had a family sing scales to a row of daisies to observe if the flowers bloomed quicker. Results? Inconclusive. But the idea stuck. You start to wonder, was it about the plants at all? Or about the people? Because when your day is hard, your wages meager, and your only constant companions are things rooted in place, maybe you talk to them because they can't talk back. Or maybe, just maybe, you feel they understand you better than people do. You get up and trail your fingers along the hedge. Edward's gone inside now, but the plants remain, still, breathing in slow, green rhythms. Waiting for morning. Waiting for someone to speak again. And you? You'll never walk past a fern without wondering what it might say in return. You wake the next morning with your boots still a bit damp from yesterday's garden wander and a strange, lingering feeling, like something unsaid is rustling in your memory. It's not just the cabbage whispering anymore. It's the why of it all. Why did so many Victorians, from the lowliest apprentice to the lords of botanical empire, believe their plants might listen? You walk back down a gravel path and kneel near a row of tulips that somehow look bashful, if that's even possible. The morning is clearer today, less fog and more of that crisp, dew-soaked chill that makes your teeth ache just from breathing. It's quiet, too quiet, until you hear it, a whisper. Or is it just the wind in the trees? You lean in anyway, just in case. Talking to plants in the Victorian era wasn't merely an act of affection. It was wrapped up in the thrilling, blossoming world of science. And the Victorians were obsessed with science. It was the age of Darwin, of microscopes, of telegrams crackling across oceans. Yet for all their fascination with wires and steam, they still leaned close to their geraniums and spoke like the flowers had ears. You crouched beside an old leather-bound gardening book, left on a bench and warped slightly by last night's mist. The page is open to a chapter titled, On the Proper Temperament for Cultivation. It reads like a meditation manual more than a horticultural guide. Speak to your charges not as master the subject, but as one partner to another in God's green design. A partner, that was the key. The Victorians weren't just planting, they were co-creating. They believed, some sincerely and some theatrically, that plants were living beings with preferences, moods, and perhaps personalities. And talking was part of that sacred relationship. Mainstream science didn't discourage this, either, not at first. In fact, in 1848, a strange and influential book was published, The Power of Words on Living Matter by Dr. Benjamin Wordsley. In it, he claimed that vocal vibrations could influence cellular behavior. He'd experimented, allegedly, by yelling at one set of ivy cuttings while reading poetry to another. Predictably, The poetry-receiving plants thrived. Or so he claimed. Historians still argue whether Wordsley's experiments were real, fabricated, or just exaggerated beyond belief by the press, who found the idea irresistibly absurd. You pluck a loose petal from a tulip and hold it to the light. Was it shaped by sun, by water, or by bedtime ballads whispered from an old gardener's lips? Enter a new figure to your imagination, Miss Constance Leroux. She's not a scientist. She's not even British. She's a French opera singer turned Victorian socialite who arrived in London in the 1860s with a flair for drama and a greenhouse full of roses named after composers. Chopin, Berlioz, Schubert. Yes, each bloomed with its own label and musical temperament. She swore that when she sang arias in the garden, only certain roses bloomed. The critics laughed. The public swooned. A journalist once snuck into her garden under moonlight, hoping to catch her in the act. He wrote, "The lady warbled with such passion into the azaleas that I began to believe they'd sprout legs and dance." Were the plants really responding? Probably not. But Miss Leroux believed it, and her roses, by every account, were astonishing. You trail a finger along the garden path as your mind flits to a quieter man, Dr. Albrecht Fenwick, a Cambridge botanist who tried to run a double-blind experiment in 1871. He hired students to speak nonsense phrases to identical plants. One group used cheerful tones. The other scolded them like they'd spilled tea on the carpet. The cheerful plants grew taller. Was it sunlight variation? Coincidence? Historians still debate the methodology. But Fenwick's paper caused a stir, and a phrase, "politeness promotes petunias," actually made into a magazine. You smile at that, because it's very Victorian, isn't it? Dignity, decorum, and daffodils. And still, fringe beliefs linger just beneath all this polished soil. Some amateur scientists believe plant communication worked both ways. That plants talk back, not in words, but in color, in growth, in scent. One woman in Lancashire swore her lilies released stronger fragrance only after she told them about her dreams. Another man claimed his geraniums curled their leaves in disgust when he sang out of key. Let's not forget poor Harold Biddlestone, an aspiring inventor who created the Fona shrub, a mechanical device that read classic poetry into his flower beds using a crank and a rotating tin cylinder. It worked about as well as you'd expect, which is to say, not at all. But still he believed. For 2 whole years, until lightning struck it. And here's where we dig a little deeper. Because at its root, this wasn't about empirical evidence. It was about hope. You look around a garden and realize, to the Victorians, everything in nature was a mirror, a moral lesson, a metaphor. Plants that listened could be healed. They could thrive through kindness. And in a world where medical knowledge was still guessing and children still died from teething, a green miracle, even imagined, was better than none at all. Even the language of flowers played into this. You remember that, right? The Victorians had entire dictionaries of Floriography, where every bloom meant something. A yellow rose signified jealousy. A white lily meant purity. So, if plants had meanings, was it such a leap to believe they had feelings too? And if they had feelings, of course you'd talk to them. You wouldn't just water them. You'd apologize when you pruned too deeply. You'd sing to them after a frost. You'd whisper to them while clipping their neighbors, reassuring them they were next but still beloved. There's something heartbreakingly sweet about it, isn't there? In an age of coal smoke and social strictness, here were these men and women, stooping low and telling a pansy, "You've done so well today." Even the Royal Horticultural Society got in on the debate. In 1889, they published a letter from a Scottish gardener who described sitting beside his hydrangeas each evening, reciting limericks and tallying blossom counts. He concluded the ones with laughter grew fastest. He wasn't joking. Of course, not everyone was enchanted. Some dismissed it as sentimental rubbish. A stern editorial in the Times insisted in 1892 that a garden, like a child, requires discipline, not dithering. That writer clearly never grew roses. But you begin to feel the pull, the soft tug of possibility. Could it be that there is something about the human voice, its rhythm, its warmth, that touches more than human ears? Could a plant, in its slow green way, recognize kindness? You sit back down on that stone bench, this time with less skepticism and more wonder. You think about Miss LaRue and her operatic dahlias, about Dr. Fenwick's cheerful nonsense, about Edward, the cabbage whisperer, about yourself. Because now, even in this moment of rest, your eyes linger a little longer on the roses. You watch for a twitch, a tilt, some invisible shift in leaf that says, "Yes, I heard you." And who knows, maybe tomorrow, when no one's around, you'll speak to them too. The next afternoon rolls in with a hush so soft it feels like the garden is holding its breath, waiting for someone to say something. You walk slowly now, not because you're tired, but because it feels wrong to rush, as if hurrying past the ivy might hurt its feelings. You pass under an arch of climbing roses and into a shaded nook of Victorian paradise. The fernery. Yes, you heard right. A fernery. Not a greenhouse. Not a garden shed. A fernery. Because during the Victorian era, ferns were not just plants. They were obsessions. And in some households, these green, feathery fronds were treated like beloved pets, or, in more dramatic cases, like emotionally fragile house guests. Welcome to the leafy sanctuary where ladies whispered to their foliage like nervous confessions and claimed, without a hint of irony, that their ferns responded with affection. You step into the drawing room of Lady Agnes Willoughby, whose house smells faintly of lavender, lemon polish, and loam. Lace curtains catch the light just enough to give the room a kind of holy glow, like stepping inside a cathedral built entirely for fronds. And there, in the center of it all, stands a towering tree fern, proudly potted in a terracotta urn. Its name, because of course it has one, is Geraldine. Geraldine is not merely decorative. She's a confidant. Lady Agnes, a widow in her mid-50s with a fondness for lemon sponge and speculative botany, swears that Geraldine responds to her voice. She droops if I'm anxious, she tells guests, and she perks if I hum softly in the morning. It's not nonsense. It's just attentiveness. You sit on an embroidered footstool as the lady fusses with a watering can shaped like a peacock. She tells you she read about this kind of connection in The Fern Lover's Companion, a real Victorian-era book that described fern care in the same tone one might use for raising delicate children. Lady Agnes whispers to her fern, always gently, always with feeling, never sarcasm. You don't mock Geraldine in this house, unless you want to be politely uninvited forever. Here's a quirky tidbit. Fern fever was a real phenomenon. They called it pteridomania. And yes, it's as ridiculous and delightful as it sounds. Entire families would tramp through muddy hills just to collect a single rare fern. Magazines featured fern arrangement contests. People decorated their homes with fern motifs on every imaginable surface. Furniture, wallpaper, tablecloths. There were even fern-themed Valentine's cards. Historians still argue whether this was just a passing aesthetic trend or a deeper cultural longing for something wild and ancient and quiet. You lean in to inspect Geraldine's fronds. They're a little dry at the edges. Bit of a sulk today, Lady Agnes says, adjusting a lace doily beneath the pot. She doesn't care for thunderstorms. And you realize there's a kind of truth in all this, even if not in the strict scientific sense. By treating the plant as conscious, Lady Agnes becomes more attentive. She notices the leaf curl, the soil moisture, the morning light pattern. Her belief in the fern's personality, however imagined, leads to better care. And perhaps that's the secret. This wasn't about proof. It was about connection. There's something endearing about this one-sided conversation. You wouldn't feel silly talking to a dog, right? Or even a baby. So why not a fern? It's just a slower form of companionship. But not everyone limited their devotion to quiet parlors. Some women brought their ferns to parties. Yes, really. A popular London hostess named Miss Penelope Kitteridge once hosted a fern cotillion, during which guests wore live ferns in elaborate headdresses and danced around a central fern altar while reciting poems. Someone tripped, someone sneezed violently, and a very expensive pot was shattered, but no one forgot it. Another eccentric soul, the Honorable Tobias Finch, held afternoon teas where guests were instructed to speak encouragement to the greenery. He believed that the emotional atmosphere of a room lingered in its flora. A bitter argument can wilt a maidenhair, he insisted. He died with 47 potted ferns and no spouse. Somehow, you feel fond of him for that. You glance around a fernery and see framed portraits of plants, actual paintings of individual ferns, posed like family members. And maybe that's the best way to understand it. These weren't just objects. They were part of the household. Named, known, spoken to, missed when gone. One journal from the time recounts a woman who wore a lock of fern in a locket after her favorite potted specimen died during a move. She called it her silent friend and wrote letters to it posthumously. Odd? Yes. But tell me you haven't mourned the sudden yellowing of a beloved houseplant. We all have our Geraldines. You reach toward one particularly fine frond, soft, delicate, impossibly symmetrical, and you whisper, "Looking good today." No one laughs. Not even you. This wasn't isolated madness. Even serious academics noted the trend. A professor of natural philosophy wrote in 1873, "There exists in society a curious tendency to project soulfulness onto verdure. It is as though nature, in its stillness, becomes a canvas for our inner monologues." And he was right. Plants became emotional placeholders, mirrors, listeners, especially for women who, in that era, weren't always granted human listeners of their own. In a world where emotional expression could be discouraged or ignored, the fern never rolled its eyes, never interrupted, never told you to be quiet. That made it sacred. And so they talked, and the ferns, in their quiet way, thrived. You step out of the fernery and into the brighter light of the garden beyond, but the softness stays with you. There's something gentle that lingers, a kind of emotional afterglow. You keep thinking of Geraldine, of Lady Agnes' hands brushing her pot like it was made of porcelain, of the rustling hush as she left the room so as not to startle the leaves. You cross a patch of clover and pause near a low stone wall. Behind it, more ferns wave in the breeze. Ferns no one's named, no one spoken to. You feel a tiny pang of guilt, like passing someone you forgot to say goodbye to. You speak without thinking. Lovely shade you got there. A breeze answers. Coincidence? Surely. But still, you smile, because whether it's scientifically real or not, something happens when you speak kindly to something that cannot answer back. Something inside you softens, slows. Roots, maybe, just a little. And tonight, maybe you'll think of Geraldine as you drift off, not as a plant, but as a reminder that being gentle, even toward the silent things, has a way of echoing back. The air has changed. It's heavier now, with that damp sort of stillness that precedes a summer storm. You push open a wrought iron gate. Rust clings to your fingertips like old stories, and step into the estate's greenhouse. It breathes around you, warm and glassy, like a sealed-off chapel for chlorophyll and quiet grief. The scent of citrus and compost mixes with something faintly metallic, as if the plants here have absorbed secrets into their stems. You stand very still, trying not to disturb the moment. In the center of the greenhouse is a man in a dark brown coat, hunched over a wooden stool beside a potted orchid. He isn't tending to it. He's confessing to it. No, really confessing. His name is Mr. Lionel Perks. Mid-40s. Heavy hands. Widower. Not particularly religious. But for the past several months, he's been speaking to his favorite orchid at twilight the way one might talk to a priest who also happens to bloom once a year in flaming purple. The orchid's name? Margaret. He named it after his wife. And before you write that off as tragic eccentricity, consider this. He's not alone. In Victorian Britain, many people believed that the greenhouse wasn't just a space for propagation. It was a sanctuary for the soul. And when no one else would listen, the plants would. You shift your weight, and the gravel crunches. Mr. Perks doesn't turn around. He just keeps speaking in that same low voice, as though the orchid's silence is sacred. "I'm trying, you know, even if the beans rotted this year, even if I forgot the apples." He sighs deeply. "I just miss her. And it's not weird. Not really. Because back then, this kind of interaction wasn't seen as madness. It was seen as private devotion. Victorian gardeners, particularly men who had no one else to talk to, often turned their greenhouses into chapels, shrines. And yes, Confessionals. The plants became their witnesses, their sounding boards, their therapists before therapy was a thing you could afford or admit to needing. Here's your historical anchor. By the 1870s, gardening manuals included phrases like, "Speak softly in the house of glass," and "Let your thoughts settle among the roots," which is oddly poetic for a book that also spends 3 pages on manure ratios. This quiet communication wasn't just emotional. It bordered on spiritual. Some believed the plants absorb your energy, your grief, your joy. One theory, not entirely fringe at the time, was that the carbon dioxide you exhaled while sharing your heartache actually strengthened the plant, and in return, its increased vitality would heal you. Mutual benefit. A biological confessional booth. You kneel beside a fern near the door. Its fronds are speckled with condensation, like it's been sweating through someone's secrets. You wonder what it's heard, what heartbreaks it's absorbed, maybe even what it's forgiven. And this wasn't limited to private gardeners. At large estates like Helligan or Chatsworth, it was common knowledge among the undergardeners that certain plants were better for listening. Orchids, with their quiet elegance, were the preferred listeners for grief. Tomatoes, oddly enough, were for frustration. And vines? Vines were for love. You could spill your longing into the morning glory and hope it'd climb its way to someone who needed to hear it. Of course, none of this was written down officially. These were whispers in the potting sheds, shared over mugs of weak tea and the occasional nip of sherry. But they were real. There's an old story, probably half true, which is enough, about a gardener named Horace who worked on an estate in Cornwall. He was known for his temper, slammed the gate, snapped at junior staff, cursed under his breath more than a Dickens villain. But every night, he'd slip into the greenhouse and speak, in the softest tone, to a lemon tree, called it Miss Penelope, brought it tiny lace doilies to stand its pot on. No one teased him, not even the footman, because Miss Penelope produced the juiciest lemons anyone had ever tasted. Historians still argue whether this kind of behavior was a reflection of loneliness, emotional repression, or early understandings of therapeutic ritual. Probably a blend of all 3. The Victorians had a lot of feelings they weren't allowed to express, so they buried them, or, in this case, potted them. You look back at Mr. Perks. He's quiet now, one hand resting lightly on the pot's rim like he's waiting for the orchid to answer. And, in a way, it does. A single petal flutters in the heat. Nothing dramatic, just acknowledgement. Let's talk about the plants themselves for a moment. Certain species became listeners simply because they looked the part. Orchids, with their human-like symmetry. Monstera, with its gaping, ear-shaped leaves. Even hydrangeas got roped in, with their clustered blooms suggesting tightly packed thoughts or unspoken prayers. People projected onto them faces, emotions, responses. One woman in Sussex claimed her hydrangea wilted in sympathy after her engagement was broken off. No one questioned it. Some greenhouse owners even kept chairs specifically for speaking sessions. They'd sit beside their favorite tree or fern or vine and read it letters, sometimes aloud, especially letters they couldn't send. And when you live in a time when "Dear Father, I'm not joining the clergy" could get you disowned, that meant a lot of letters were read to the rhododendrons. There's a fringe case you'll love. A gentleman in Kent, Mr. Archibald Rainsby, built a listening lattice, a series of potted climbing plants arranged in a circle around a cushioned bench. He'd sit inside and deliver soliloquies about everything from the price of tobacco to his regrets in war. Claimed the jasmine nodded when he hit a particularly painful memory. Of course, he also tried to marry a mannequin once, so grain of salt. Still, it speaks to something. The need to be heard. And if no one else will listen, why not a thing that alive? You walk slowly through the greenhouse, past waxy leaves and silent mosses. It's so easy to imagine the echoes of thousands of stories, soaked up like water into roots. Sadness, joy, secrets never shared. Every greenhouse was a cathedral of unspoken emotions. And maybe that's why some people got better after gardening. Not just physically, though digging and hauling does wonders, but emotionally. The garden doesn't judge. It doesn't interrupt. It simply exists. It grows. It listens in the slowest, kindest way. You exit through a door left slightly ajar, the wood worn smooth by a century of gardeners passing through with heavy boots and heavier thoughts. The sky is grayer now, and thunder stirs in the distance like a conversation too big to begin just yet. You glance back once. The greenhouse is quiet again, but you know better. The storm arrives quietly, at first, just a flicker in the sky, like nature clearing its throat. You find shelter beneath the garden's stone arch, mossy and crumbling at the corners, and watch the rain slide down ivy leaves like tears on green cheeks. There's something electric in the air now. Not frightening, exactly, just alive. And under that watchful gray sky, you hear something strange. Faint, almost rhythmic. Not thunder, not birds. Clicking. You follow the sound around a bend in the path, where the ornamental beds give way to rougher ground and compost piles. The air grows earthy, thick with the scent of decaying leaves and soil so rich it seems to hum. And then you see it. An old gardener hunched beside a wooden box, tapping a stick gently against the dirt. Testing the mood, he mutters without turning around. She's a bit cross today. This is Mr. Hensley. He's been on the estate since before most of the topiary animals lost their ears. And what he's doing, according to him, is listening to the soil. Victorian gardening had its proper side, the lace-gloved ladies and greenhouse gentlemen, but it also had its mystics, the fringe dwellers, the whisperers. And in places like this, where compost steams like a sleeping beast and beetles crawl like ink stains across your boots, those fringe beliefs grew wild. You squat beside Mr. Hensley. He hands you a trowel, as if this is your job now. Tell me what she smells like, he says. You hesitate. Sniff. Mushrooms? You offer. He shakes his head. Regret. You laugh, but quietly, because something in his expression says he's only half joking. Victorians believed the soil had moods. Yes, really, there were books, not fringe pamphlets, but actual published manuals that described cheerful soil and melancholy loam. Some claimed the worms were a garden's choir, singing secrets beneath your feet. Others believed fungal patterns could predict the health of future crops, or your marriage. One journal from 1864 includes a diagram labeled Emotional Zones of the English Garden, with arrows pointing to patches of land described as anxious, ambivalent, and romantically hopeful. You cannot make this up. Or, rather, the Victorians already did. Historians still argue whether these writings were symbolic metaphors or sincere attempts at emotional botany. Probably both. But it was serious enough that some gardeners developed their own systems. Soil diaries, scent maps, even rudimentary compost augury, where the way a pile decomposed was read like tea leaves. You dig a little into the dirt. It's warm, alive, and strangely comforting. Mr. Hensley tells you about an estate cook who always brought her leftover onion skins to a specific corner of the garden. Said the marigolds liked to gossip. Another footman once buried a lock of his lover's hair beneath the lavender bed after she married someone else. The lavender never bloomed again. Coincidence or heartbreak? And here's the weirdest part. Even proper scientists dipped their toes into this earthy esoterica. In 1875, an experimental gardener named Miss Eliza Bainforth claimed she could predict plant success based on the mood of the mulch. She categorized composts as friendly, brooding, or resentful, depending on how they smelled after stirring. Her paper was presented at a local botany club. No one laughed. They applauded. You reach down, take a handful of soil, and crumble it between your fingers. It's soft, loamy. It doesn't speak, not really, but it holds something. A story. Time slowed down decay and rebirth. Maybe that's why people thought it had wisdom. Another quirky tidbit. Victorians sometimes buried objects beneath their garden beds for energetic encouragement. Buttons, coins, scraps of poetry, even tiny portraits. There was a belief that personal items could infuse the soil with intention. One man wrote that his strawberries soured less after burying his late wife's comb beneath them. Romantic or just creepy? You decide. Mr. Hensley stands and brushes his knees. Come on, he says. The worms will show you. You follow him to a shed that smells of mold and linseed oil. Inside, rows of jars line the walls, each filled with soil from a different corner of the estate, labeled like wine vintages. This one's from the old birch grove, he says, holding up a jar that looks like crumb cake. She's chatty in spring. Some jars contain live worms. Others are just damp earth. But every one of them, he insists, has a story. You hold one labeled North Wall after the storm. There's nothing in it but darkness and scent, but still, it feels personal. Victorian gardeners were nothing if not obsessive. Soil was not just dirt. It was memory, mood, mystery. They'd talk to it, bless it, apologize to it after walking across it too soon. And the soil, in turn, responded, at least in the language of sprouts and bloom. One fringe theory from the era posited that soil retained emotional resonance, a kind of psychic mulch. It sounds laughable, but then again, so does talking to ferns. And yet, here you are. Outside, the storm finally breaks. Rain hits the greenhouse roof like applause. Mr. Hensley stands in the doorway, letting the mist touch his face. She needed that, he says. Whether he means the soil, the garden, or himself, you can't quite tell. You look back at the compost pile. It's steaming again, the kind of warm, living breath that makes you believe the whole garden is listening. And you're starting to believe it too. Because when you speak to the soil, you're not just nurturing plants. You're rooting yourself in memory, in care, in something slower and older than words. You walk back to the garden with mud on your boots and something strange in your chest, like peace, but deeper, like patience. The rain slows, the leaves glisten, and the worms, beneath it all, carry the whispers down, 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 where roots can listen. The storm rolls off toward the hills overnight, and by morning, the garden has been transformed into something softer, like it exhaled in the dark and decided to forgive the world. The air smells like damp petals and old secrets. You follow the winding path toward a place you haven't visited yet. Kew Gardens. Yes, that Kew. The Royal Botanic Gardens, epicenter of Victorian plant obsession, where imperial pride and floral fascination met in a spectacular tangle of glass houses, ambition, and an alarming number of palm trees. As you cross under its regal entrance and step into the colossal palm house, a curving iron-and-glass structure so steamy it could fog your thoughts. You don't feel like a visitor. You feel like a humble extra in some giant green opera, where every leaf is a diva, and every fern expects a standing ovation. Here, in the heart of the Empire's botanical crown jewel, the question of whether plants could hear or respond to human presence wasn't just a garden party debate. It was serious business. And among the rows of orchids and towering banana trees, scientists, real ones with degrees and neckties, were beginning to ask something bolder. Could plants not only respond, but perhaps communicate? You wind past a display of carnivorous plants, all slime mouths and velvet traps, and hear the soft patter of boots on stone walkways. A young botanist, not much older than you, is muttering something to a cluster of sensitive plants, Mimosa pudica, the kind that folds its leaves when touched. His tone is experimental, but there's a note of affection, too. He taps a leaf. It recoils. Told you so, he whispers. This wasn't just Victorian whimsy anymore. It was edging into the realm of proto-science. Back in the 1860s, researchers at Kew began studying how plants reacted to environment, not just in terms of sunlight and water, but touch, vibration, even human proximity. Charles Darwin himself, yes, the beard, the turtle guy, conducted experiments on plant movement. He was fascinated by how vines could search for supports, how roots avoided obstacles. Though he never claimed plants could hear us, he absolutely wrote about their subtle, purposeful movements, what he called plant intelligence. Historians still argue whether Darwin was opening the door to plant sentience or simply documenting reactive biology. But let's just say this. If he caught you whispering compliments to a geranium, he probably wouldn't have laughed. He might have taken notes. And Darwin wasn't alone. One of his close collaborators, the wonderfully named Sir Francis Darwin, his son, once suggested that roots behave like the brain of the plant. People scoffed. But in Kew's hallowed halls, that idea found fertile ground. You paused beside a fish-hew's tree, overhearing a conversation between two scholars, both wearing waistcoats slightly too small, as was fashionable at the time. But if it responds to tone, then surely it senses tone, Harold, which implies perception, and perception implies. They trail off, noticing you. Enjoying the flora? One asks, raising an eyebrow. Just listening, you say. They nod, respectfully. Even Queen Victoria herself wasn't immune to the green allure. Though she never made speeches to sunflowers that we know of, she took a personal interest in the expansion of Kew. Several of her gardeners were known for their quiet manners in the gardens. One, in particular, Mr. Edwin Hollis, was said to have walked the length of the Palm House each morning, murmuring observations not for his staff, but for the plants. "You've come in well," he'd say to the citrus trees. "Too much pride today, rosemary." His journal exists in fragments, filled with these tiny garden dialogues, as though the plants were his colleagues. Here's where things turned delightfully strange. By the 1880s, music entered the chat. Literally, some amateur botanists began conducting sound experiments, playing music near their plants to see if it improved growth. A group in Oxford reportedly sang madrigals to marigolds. Results, unclear. One estate in Sussex claimed its tomatoes flourished when exposed to Mozart. Another insisted the dahlias died faster when exposed to Wagner. Whether this was science or sheer snobbery, well, you can probably guess. And yet the idea stuck, that somehow sound, even human speech, had a physical effect on plants. Not in a magical way, but in a way that could be observed, documented, maybe even replicated. One fringe pamphlet from 1892, written by Mrs. Temperance LaRue, claimed that plants possessed subtle auditory fibers that responded only to benevolent frequencies, those colored by sincerity and moral uplift. She insisted this was why her begonias failed when her cousin, a known cynic, visited. A bit dramatic, perhaps, but a perfect Victorian sentence. You stroll into the Temperate House now, another glass cathedral filled with sweet gum trees and ferns the size of carriages. It's quieter here, reverent. You pass a gardener standing in absolute stillness beside a potted olive tree. He's not watering. He's not pruning. He's just present. You catch his eye. "Does it help?" you ask. He smiles. "Not sure if it helps the plant," he says. "But it helps me." That's the thread running through it all, isn't it? Whether or not the plants truly heard, whether they reacted to voice, tone, or simply the carbon dioxide you puffed into the air while babbling, it was about attention, care, intentional presence. In an era bustling with telegrams, gaslight, and the grinding gears of empire, this was one of the few spaces where time slowed, where something ancient and speechless seemed to welcome your company. And perhaps that's why the idea persists. You sit on a low bench near a cluster of palms and think of the gardeners you've met so far. Edward, whispering to cabbages. Lady Agnes and her adored fern Geraldine. Mr. Perks, confiding in his orchid. Mr. Hensley, listening to worms. And now these quiet professionals at Kew, armed with both pruning shears and existential questions. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about being heard, even if only by something that never answered. You close your eyes. Somewhere, deep in the foliage, a leaf rustles, maybe from the wind, or maybe something else. Evening returns, slow and golden, and you step away from the grandeur Kew Gardens towards something humbler, a private allotment tucked between bramble and brick, the kind of quiet garden space where life doesn't perform. It just is. Here, the fences are low, the soil a little unruly, and everything smells like tomatoes and drying laundry. The wind carries the scent of jasmine and warm bread. This, you realize, is where the whispers happen unnoticed. You lean on a crooked fence and watch an older woman in a blue shawl mumble to her peas. She's not performing. She's not reciting poetry. She's not even paying attention to whether anyone's watching. She's just being, and the peas, by the look of them, are listening intently. This is where the Victorian garden lore becomes something quieter, something inherited, not written down in journals or displayed in greenhouses, but passed from hand to hand like a well-oiled spade. You're in the territory of folklore now, where the line between truth and story is comfortably blurred, and nobody feels the need to correct it. The woman notices you and smiles. "I tell stories," she says. "Not every day. Just when they look a bit discouraged. You know it like this is the most normal thing in the world. Because by now it is." Across the 19th century, thousands of working-class gardeners tended tiny plots behind row houses, schools, or even coal yards. They didn't have journals or Latin plant labels, but they did have ritual, routine, and belief. And in their world, talking to plants wasn't a question of science. It was common sense. You find a seat beside an old watering can as the woman ties twine to support her runner beans. "They don't like arguing," she adds. "Beans. They sulk." You grin. Of course they do. Victorian folk wisdom was filled with these intimate rules. Not the high-minded language of Kew, but the soft, well-worn phrases of gardeners whose hands were always dirty and whose voices were always low. One common belief? Plants grew better when they knew your name. So most people introduce themselves to new plantings, often aloud, usually with a nod of the head. Another? If you shared a secret with your herbs, they'd carry it kindly. Basil was considered a particularly loyal confidant. "Don't lie near basil," the saying went, "for it always remembers." Here's a quirky gem. In East Anglia, some gardeners believed that plants learn from each other by listening. So if your roses were underperforming, you'd place them near a thriving bed and whisper praise to strong ones, hoping the weaker batch would eavesdrop and improve out of jealousy. Historians still argue whether this was metaphor or superstition, or just good shade management disguised as drama. But the story stuck. The woman hands you a small bag of nasturtium seeds. "They like songs," she says. "Folk ones. Old, if you got 'em. Don't try anything too modern. They're fussy." You can't tell if she's joking. You kind of hope she's not. Even within rural parishes, churchyards, and tenant gardens, the idea of plant communication often took on a spiritual tint. Not religion, exactly, but reverence. Plants were God's quiet creatures, unjudging, humble, and when you spoke to them kindly, it was seen as both an act of devotion and of decency. There's an old Welsh tale about a boy who shouted insults at a hawthorn tree. The next day, his bees refused to come home. A cautionary tale? Maybe, but it kept a generation of children from yelling at shrubbery, which is a public good no matter how you spin it. Back in London, window boxes bloomed above smog-choked streets, and factory workers leaned out in the early morning to murmur greetings to their geraniums before the daily grind. Some landlords even installed mirrors behind flower boxes. Not for vanity, but so tenants could watch their plant from bed and send thoughts of encouragement through the reflection. And yes, fringe pamphlets even encouraged talking to seeds. Speak to them of the sun they'll meet, one guidebook advised, and they will reach toward it more bravely. You think that sounds like a quote from a motivational speaker, but here it's horticulture. You follow a gravel footpath as the woman finishes her tending and nods you toward the edge of the garden, where a cluster of children are kneeling around a pumpkin patch. One girl is whispering to a sprout like it's a nervous puppy. "You can do it," she says. No pressure, but you're the only one I named. The other children laugh. The sprout stays silent, but somehow it feels included. This is how the tradition passed on, not through books, but through hands and time. A grandmother teaching you to speak blessings to your seedlings. A friend insisting that lavender wilts near liars. A neighbor who plays lullabies to carrots. You sit under an overgrown trellis and watch the shadows grow long across the beds. The garden isn't polished. It's messy, alive, human. And the idea that these plants might respond to tone, intention, love, it doesn't feel absurd. It feels correct, even if the science never proves it. Even if the skeptics roll their eyes. Because when you kneel by a plant and whisper, "Thank you," the world doesn't get smaller, it gets deeper. And something within you, something old and wordless, leans in. The sky deepens into that indigo velvet dusk, the kind that feels like the garden is closing its eyes with you. Crickets tune their instruments. A bat slices once through the air, then vanishes. And you're back at the start. Not the literal start, but the quiet corner of the estate where the first gardener whispered to his cabbages. The place where the journey began. And now, as twilight drapes itself gently over the hedges, you feel the weight of every story you've gathered like petals tucked in your pockets. The plants are still, but not silent, because once you've learned to listen, even stillness has shape. You walk slowly now, along the mossy flagstones, brushing your fingers along sage leaves that smell of dinners long gone. You pass the fernery, where Geraldine rests with aristocratic calm, and a greenhouse where orchids still cradle confessions from 100 twilight visits. Each plant feels a little different now, not just a leaf or stem, but a witness, a participant, a partner in a strange and beautiful conversation that spans centuries. It's not just the Victorians who believed in this communion. The idea is older than greenhouses and Latin labels. Ancient Greeks believed certain trees held souls. Indigenous cultures around the world have long understood plants as beings, not background. Even in medieval monasteries, monks would sing to their herbs, not out of whimsy, but because they saw it as divine respect. The Victorians, eccentric as they were, just repackaged these beliefs in lace gloves and long-handled shears. You kneel beside a rose bush now, and it feels right to say something, not to test a theory, just to connect. "Still awake?" you whisper. No answer. And yet, you think of the Victorian botanist who believed marigolds were shy, the gardener who buried apologies beneath his mint, the woman who sang lullabies to nasturtiums, and the man who waited for his lemon tree to forgive him. None of it was science, not really, but it was real, and maybe that's enough. Because when you whisper to a leaf, it's not just about the leaf. It's about what grows in you when you do it. Gentleness, patience, wonder. Here's a last of historical oddity to tuck under your pillow. In 1899, a retired sea captain named Ambrose Fennell built a wooden listening box in his garden, a small booth where he'd sit for hours beside a vine-covered wall, reporting the atmospheric mood of the plants. His neighbors thought he'd gone mad, but when he died, every flower on the property bloomed a week early. Coincidence? Historians still argue whether the plants grieved, or whether Ambrose simply knew how to time his planting. You rise slowly, stretching limbs heavy with stories. Around you, the garden fades into silhouettes. The shapes of leaves blur into one another, but you know them now, not by name, but by presence. You pass the soil beds where Mr. Hensley once whispered regrets to the worms. The earth is quiet, and yet you feel it remembering. Beyond the hedge, you hear a rustle. Maybe a cat, maybe a fox, maybe something older. You stop by a tree and lean your forehead against the bark. "Thank you," you say. The wind stirs the leaves in reply. And for a moment you believe, no, you know, that you've been part of something. A long, slow conversation spoken not in syllables, but in care, in breath, in growth. And the plants? They listened. So now, with the journey complete and the garden resting, let your breath slow. Let your thoughts settle like pollen drifting through a still greenhouse. You've walked the mossy paths, peeked into secret greenhouses, and bent your ear towards silent petals. You've met gardeners who cried into orchids, argued with beans, and buried small truths beneath mint and rosemary. And through all of it, one quiet thread wove itself around you. That care, spoken aloud or whispered in your mind, matters. Not because a cabbage will recite Shakespeare or a fern will follow you home, but because kindness, even unanswered, changes you. The Victorians didn't have all the answers, but they had rituals. They had reverence. And in their own peculiar lace-trimmed way, they knew something we're only just remembering. That talking plants might not make them smarter, but it might make us softer. So tonight, as you drift toward sleep, imagine yourself back there, kneeling beside Geraldine the fern, or sitting quietly among the whispering vines, or placing one hand on warm, living soil. Let the silence speak. Let the stillness hold you. And if something green visits your dreams, well, be polite. Say hello.